Hi, my name's Ian and welcome to my channel. The purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and their cons, what is essential books and the items that you need to play them, with different editions and multiple games coming back onto the market through the likes of Drive-Thru RPG and re-releases of old games. It's a bit of a minefield, and some newcomers to the field may get confused in which edition or which game or whatever might be right for them. So this this series gives a potted history of the various games and the editions of choice that we're dealing with, and just throws it out there, explains what's available to it, how to get into the game, and what books are currently the best ones to get. So for this one, if you've been watching any of my videos leading up here, you'll know that I'm a bit of a fan of pulp fiction, especially the pulp fantasy and science fiction from back in the day. Pulp fiction refers to stories that were largely published in magazines that were fabricated from a really cheap and nasty paper, the pulp of that. And they were the launch pad of many fictional characters and their authors. So some of the ones that we love today, for example, if you've heard of Doc Savage or Khazar, the Shadow, Buck Rogers, Conan the Barbarian, Tarzan, Zorro, Solomon Kane, John Carter of Mars, to name but a few. Writing for the pulps also formed at least part of the careers of the authors that we know today as staples of various genres. Asimov, Burroughs, Clarke, Dick, Fitzgerald, Haggard, Howard, Kipling, Leiber, Silverberg, a handful of Smiths, Vance, Wells, among many more, including the leading light of the subject for today, H.P. Lovecraft, and his most famous creation, Cthulhu. Now, we're not going to do a full-blown biography of Lovecraft, but suffice to say that he did have a life full of tragedy. That may have contributed to the nihilistic nature of his writing. He was a prolific writer, but never managed to attain a point where he could sustain himself professionally during his lifetime. In fact, it's fair to say that he is more famous now than he ever was during his lifetime. His first published story, The Alchemist, was written when he was 17 or 18 in 1908, and was published about 8 years later in United Amateur in 1916. The story was the stage for Lovecraft's brand of dark fantasy horror, and also the core theme of the game that was eventually to be, but we'll cover that a bit later. In this story we have a mystery surrounding the protagonist's family that he is eventually compelled to investigate, and ultimately uncovers its shocking truth. I'm not going to tell you what happens, go and read it. He continued to write up until his death in 1937, but during the 2-decade period he'd laid down the foundations for what would be known as Lovecraftian horror and the Cthulhu mythos. Not only that, but his correspondence with inspired, in a two-way fashion, a number of authors, predominantly Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Bucknut Long and August Derleth, but also such figures as James Blish and Fritz Leiber. All of these authors, Lovecraft included, wove the imaginings of each other's works into their own. So, for example, much of the backdrop of Conan's Hyboria and Smith's Averoigne have Lovecraft touches to them. And similarly, the entities Sothagua, created by Smith, appeared in Lovecraft's The Whisperer in the Darkness. All in all, though, through the short stories in the pulps, these authors were building, perhaps more by accident than design, a shared universe to rival that displayed on screen by Marvel today. August Derleth, as we noted, one of H.P. Lovecraft's circle, coined a phrase for this shared underlying set of themes, the Cthulhu mythos. It is also thanks to Derleth that Lovecraft's works are still known to us today. After Lovecraft died in 1937, Derleth attempted to get Lovecraft's stories published in compilation, but found little interest. Pulp fiction was not taken seriously, not by established publishers. So in 1939, he founded Arkham House to realise his ambition. Arkham House also published works by Derleth and a number of other authors, including Howard, Robert Bloch and Fritz Leiber and Clark Ashton Smith. He also wrote a number of works attempting to join the dots of this coined Cthulhu mythos, which were met with mixed views. The mythos was always on the fringe. The themes of fragility, an uncaring universe, and his largely unvictorious protagonists did not fit well with the mainstream, even within horror. If you analyse most horror plots, they tend to push the protagonist through a series of horrific events before he achieves victory, only for it to be revealed to the reader or the viewer that this victory is either temporary or outright false before the curtain falls. With Lovecraft, the protagonist is often relating his tale during his final moments, with everything leading up to that being a downward spiral of revelation and despair. One of the best examples of this can be found in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where our narrator carries us from a simple bus journey to the point of his contemplation of suicide and beyond through the course of the story. There is no hope. The universe doesn't care. What passes for gods are utterly indifferent. Nothing ultimately matters, and it is the increasing realization of this fact that drives Lovecraft's characters to the brink. And so, a few attempts to bring Lovecraftian stories to the big screen through the 1960s and 1970s, and Arkham House continued, more or less, to keep Lovecraft's works in print. But it was a sort of below-the-surface kind of bubble, accessible only to those that sought it out. An interest in pulp fiction was then fired up by the success of Marvel's Conan the Barbarian comic books from 1970. The success of that comic triggered a small renaissance of interest in the works of pulp and weird fiction, which set the stage for other such works to be explored. And so enter Sandy Petersen. Now, Petersen had become a fan of H.P. Lovecraft's works in the mid-1970s through reading an Armed Service Edition compilation that his father owned. At that time, role-playing was also taking off, with the publication of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. Yes, like it or not, all role-playing games go back eventually to D&D at some point. But jump forward to the late 1970s, and a company called Chaosium. Now, they had published a fantasy role-playing game of a different stripe to Dungeons & Dragons, and were in the process of assembling a horror game titled Dark Worlds. Dark Worlds never happened, but in the meantime, Petersen approached Chaosium about writing a supplement for RuneQuest that would explore the dreamlands of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, instead of doing that, Chaosium employed Petersen to take over the Dark Worlds project, writing instead a game that would use the RuneQuest-based rules, also known as basic role-playing, to explore a game setting based on Lovecraft's fiction. With an agreement with Arkham House in hand, Sandy Petersen set to the task of writing this game, Call of Cthulhu. A minor side hiccup. In 1976, TSR published Supplement 4, Gods, Demigods and Heroes for Dungeons & Dragons. In this, they included information for Conan the Barbarian and Elric of Melniboné, descriptions of heroes, magic and items and monsters from the worlds of Robert E. Howard and Michael Moorcock, respectively. Other than Marvel Comics, Conan's stories had been out of print for years, and Moorcock, in the spirit of shared ideas that can be seen within the works of Lovecraft, the Lovecraft Circle, gave TSR permission to draw from his material. Skip forward to 1980, and the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons reworking of this book resulted in Deities and Demigods, which now included the Nawan mythology with permission from Fritz Leiber, and the Cthulhu mythos with permission from Arkham House. Conan, however, was dropped, probably because there were a number of rights issues floating around regarding Conan that TSR didn't want to go anywhere near. But Arkham House had already given permission to Chaosium at this time to deal with the Cthulhu mythos in game form. And Moorcock had similarly given permission to them to produce a game based on his works, which resulted in Stormbringer. Video on that coming eventually. And so, swords were drawn. It's interesting to note that Moorcock himself found it a bit of surprise when D&D and Chaosium, for instance, started to fight over who owned the rights to the Elric cosmology, but regardless. Anyway, to avoid a large fight, a legal fight, Chaosium and TSR reached an agreement that TSR could continue to use both of the pantheons in the Deities and Demigods book, with the addition of a note thanking Chaosium. And this they did with the book's second printing. Then they removed the pantheons, but kept the note thanking Chaosium from the third printing and ultimately removed all reference to Chaosium, Elric and Cthulhu. Okay, so that aside, in 1981, the first edition of Call of Cthulhu, a box set including the basic role-playing rule booklet and the Call of Cthulhu part of the rules, saw print. Now I am going to whistle through the editions of the game because there isn't actually much difference in the actual rules between them until perhaps we reach the current edition. There are some differences in the number of skill points and whatever that people have and base percentages and so on. But by and large, the rules themselves are pretty much the same. So, a second edition was published in 1983, again in a box set form, but this time the basic role-playing rules were not included. Everything was contained in a single rule volume, with some player aids in the box. Games Workshop, as was their modus operandi at this time, picked up a license from Chaosium to publish their own version of the second edition. Third edition split the rules into Investigator and Keeper books, again contained within a box set, and again published in the UK by Games Workshop in 1986. Third edition increased the number of skill points available to investigators. From fourth edition, the game was published as a single volume, with differences in content and organisation. Also, no more Games Workshop edition. Fourth edition was released in 1989, fifth edition in 1992, with 5.2 in 1995. And 5.6 in 1999. So the first one that I could dig out from the depths of my so this is 5.6. So all of the fives tend to have this cover, but they're just a gradual cleaning up process of the rules. So our 20th anniversary edition came out in 2001, which is largely the same edition as 5.6. And during this time, Wizards of the Coast worked in concert with Chaosium and under license to produce a D20 version of the game, using the third edition Dungeons & Dragons rules as a basis, but made it as a standalone game. Sixth edition came out in 2004 with another hike in skill points, and this edition formed the basis for the celebratory 25th and 30th anniversary editions, this is the 30th anniversary edition, all nice leatherette and so on. And finally, 7th edition was released in 2014. With 7th, as we'll see in the play section of this video, characteristics are handled in a different way, as are many other game concepts. And the game itself was released as a main rulebook, the Keeper rulebook, the Keeper rulebook, and also an investigator book, which is on the shelf there if you can use a magnifying glass. These followed the general path of the previous Keeper and Investigator companions from earlier editions. The 7th edition is the most different editions of all the games to each other. Over the course of all of these editions, several supplements and play aids and adventures have been released by Chaosium. Notable amongst these are Cthulhu by Gaslight, I think this is... Oh, this is the second edition of Cthulhu by Gaslight. So, probably for the second edition rules. Yes, certainly. That's not the first or the fourth. Right. So, second or third edition. I'll just ramble a bit. Largely folded into the core rulebook from 5th edition onwards. And Dreamlands, largely drawn from the Lovecraft story, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Scenarios ran from the traditional ghost stories to more connected with the Cthulhu mythos to full-blown involved campaigns. And the best of these, for me, are the Trail of Sarthogua, Horror on the Orient Express, Masks of Nyarlathotep, Beyond the Mountains of Madness, and The Shadows of Yog-Sothoth. As a side note, Horror on the Orient Express nearly sank Chaosium as a company. A Kickstarter to produce a deluxe revised edition of this already deluxe campaign was put forward in 2013 and was very successful, raising over $500,000. However, the final product, being of monstrous size and an ill-thought-out pledge for international shipping, just ate that up. Though this oversight and pushing the company to the edge, I think ultimately it instigated good things. It saw the return of Greg Stafford, see my RuneQuest 3rd edition video, and Sandy Peterson to the Chaosium fold, pushing completion of the 7th edition of Call of Cthulhu and paving the way for the reunification of Glorantha and RuneQuest, with RuneQuest Adventures in Glorantha, which we will also get to in time. Through 2nd and 3rd editions, Call of Cthulhu also gained supplemental support from Games Workshop, in the form of the interesting Nightmare in Norway, the So-So Trail of the Loathsome Slime, and the excellent Green and Pleasant Land, and the Statue of the Sorcerer and the Vanishing Conjurer dual adventure. Another third-party company producing Cthulhu materials from 4th through to 6th edition was Pagan Publishing. They produced some solid scenarios before delving into a sort of X-Files meets Cthulhu meets Men in Black named Delta Green. While interesting in concept, I felt that this departed too much from the overarching theme of Lovecraft's work to make it into my Cthulhu library. From 5th edition on, several third-party companies have released volumes for the Call of Cthulhu game. Triad Entertainment's Fantasy Flight Games, notable especially for the Nocturnum setting, Goodman Games, Modifius Entertainment, notable for the Achtung Cthulhu variant, Cubicle 7 Entertainment, notable for the brilliant Cthulhu Britannica series, and others. Pelgrane Press also published a standalone take on the Cthulhu game under license to Chaosium, but using their own gumshoe rules in 2008. Chaosium themselves published an alternative take on the Call of Cthulhu concept and rules with Pulp Cthulhu in 2016. In this variant of the game, the protagonists are cut more in the spirit of Indiana Jones and the Doc Savage mould, facing down horrors rather than unpeeling layers of mystery to discover the full realisation of an uncaring void. If you want more action and fun than thinking with your tentacles, then this may be the version for you. All in all, Call of Cthulhu is one of those games that has successfully evolved without changing a great deal. As we'll explore in the play section, the system captures the core concepts of Lovecraft that only a true fan, as Sandy Peterson is, could have done. Chaosium remains today as one of the key players in keeping Lovecraft's legacy alive. It publishes not only the Call of Cthulhu game, but also anthologies of works connected to the literature. The Necronomicon, The Mysteries of the Worm, the Nyarlathotep cycle, Nameless Cults, the Hastur cycle, the Anarctos cycle, the Zothic Legend cycle, the Clark-Ashton cycle. My personal favourite is the Book of Ibon, and many more. They have also worked with video and board game producers to bring Cthulhu gaming into many different spheres. Within the second wave of role-playing games, Call of Cthulhu is perhaps the most prominent and certainly the one with the greatest longevity. It is a testament to the adaptability of basic role-playing as a system, and an absolute gem to play for those new to role-playing or otherwise. For this section where we delve into the rules, I'm going to focus on the 7th edition of the game, but I will reference back to previous editions from time to time. 7th is the most current and most different edition of the game, so I feel that in this case, laying focus there is warranted. Players take on the role of investigators, or at least that's what they are termed within the structure of the game. Whether a character ends up being an investigator by choice or by circumstance depends on how the game goes. Personally, I favour the characters beginning as normal folk, going about their business, that become drawn into macabre happenings. Each investigator is defined by 8 characteristics: strength, dexterity, intelligence, constitution, appearance, power, size and education. Most of these are self-explanatory, but for those that are not, power represents a mix of force of will and connection to the supernatural, and determines both the player's ability to cope with the horrific experiences without going insane, and, should the game head that way, the ability to cast spells. Education correlates to the level of education that the character possesses, from totally uneducated to doctorates and beyond. Prior to 7th edition, characteristics had a normal range of 3 to 18, with some producing percentile check chances by multiplying their values by 5. The idea roll, for example, based on intelligence, and the no roll based on education. 7th edition changed this by retaining the same rolls to generate characteristics, but then multiplying them by 5 to each represent by a percentage. So instead of a separate idea roll, what was the idea roll in previous editions is now an intelligence check, for example. Characters measure their current mental state using sanity points, which start out equal to power divided by 5, and this is also used to calculate starting magic points. Hit points are recorded as a single pool and are equal to constitution plus size divided by 10. Finally, a character starts with 3 to 18 luck points, which have various uses within the game, mainly for attempts to keep the characters alive when facing particularly difficult situations. A character's job is selected from a list of occupations. Each occupation has a list of skills, credit rating, a formula for generating skill points. Those points are divided amongst the occupation skills, and then a character gets a further block of points equal to their intelligence multiplied by 2 to spend on any skill other than the special Cthulhu Mythos skill. Skills, like in all BRP games, are expressed as percentages. When a skill is to be used, roll percentile dice, and if it's equal to or under the skill's percentage, success. Credit rating is an interesting skill that is largely used instead of keeping track of cash in a sort of can I afford this skill check. 7th edition introduces difficulty levels into the mix. Hard, rolled against 1/2 of the skill's percentage, and extreme, rolled against 1/5 of the percentage. It also introduces the idea of pushing a roll, giving a second chance at a failed check, but increasing the consequences of failure should the pushed roll not succeed. The core rules contain a number of occupations, and the Investigator's Handbook contains more, many more, and they are easy to put together on the fly if a player has a particular concept for their character. 7th edition also places a good focus on formulating backgrounds for their characters. And so, as with all BRP games, the core rules are very simple to grasp. For a game dealing with an atmosphere-heavy subject such as the Cthulhu Mythos, this is a good thing. More focus within the books and around the game table can be given to the scenario and those atmospheric elements. Speaking of which, perhaps the most significant addition to the BRP core that Call of Cthulhu in all of its editions adds is sanity. As noted, characters begin with a pool of sanity points. These they may lose when being exposed to horrific situations, from mutilated corpses to cosmic horrors. They can be regained through psychotherapy, counselling and time. However, there is the Cthulhu Mythos skill. This skill represents a character's knowledge of what is really going on, of the powerful entities that dwell in and beyond the earth, and of the utter insignificance of mankind within the grand scheme of the uncaring universe. Unlike all of the other skills, characters cannot learn this skill when first created, and cannot gain it through the normal channels of training and experience. Instead, dark tomes of mythos lore bestow points in this skill through study, and it is expected that the characters will learn more about the mythos as they investigate situations connected to it. But here comes the catch. The more characters learn, by which you could say the more successful they are at picking up the knowledge and tools that they need to work against the antagonists within the game, then the more their mind will deteriorate with the revelations of such knowledge. The Cthulhu Mythos skill represents a hard cap on the character's sanity points. The more they learn, the more susceptible to insanity they become. This one simple mechanic captures the narratives of Lovecraft's work, as we have already discussed. Narrators on the brink of breakdown or destruction, taking us through the tale of monstrous discovery that brought them to that point. It is an elegant system, and it is interesting to note that the Cthulhu-derived games include a similar mechanic. Indeed, the equivalent mechanic used for the D20 Call of Cthulhu game reappeared in the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons supplement Heroes of Horror, so key is it to this form of horror role-playing. The general course of play is often described in terms of peeling an onion. That is, the characters begin their experience with a scenario only seeing the surface of the onion, and generally not even realising that there is more to the onion than the surface. As the plot thickens, the more layers of the onion are peeled away to reveal more of what is really going on, bringing the characters closer to the horrifying core, usually a cult or a denizen of the mythos or both. A good game weaves character backgrounds into the plot, revealing innocent connections in their backstories are not necessarily as innocent as they may seem. Campaign play is possible in the traditional role-playing game sense, in that the same characters can be used to play through several scenarios, but it is a better experience, in my opinion, and more so than most games, that the scenarios within a campaign are linked to form a greater whole. This is true of the published campaigns, particularly the Masks of Nyarlathotep, which is a series of linked scenarios where investigators pick up clues and other information that lead them from one to the next. Another campaign option that works well comes in the form of a more expansive single narrative, a mega scenario, if you will, and an excellent published example there is Horror on the Orient Express. Unlike a lot of role-playing games, however, it is not good to get too attached to characters. Part of the fun of the game is the anticipation towards seeing what grisly fate will eventually consume the characters as they finally lose their sanity under the full realization of the horrors that they are dealing with. Make no mistake, Call of Cthulhu is not a game about heroic characters beating the odds to defeat great evil. This is a game about normal humans slowly coming to the realization that the odds are so heavily stacked against them, not only against themselves, but against all of humanity, and any sense of triumph over evil is as fleeting as smoke in a storm. Call of Cthulhu floats around my top 2 role-playing games. Which makes up the other one rotates between perhaps 4 or 5 other games, as mood takes me. The BRP system is adaptable and an elegant one, and the way Peterson structured it to the requirements of the Lovecraftian game is masterful. The rules have evolved over time with tweaks here and there, but mainly with respect to their organisation and ease of use. For this reason, I wholly recommend the current 7th edition, or if you're more of a mind towards the classic game, 6th edition. Supplements and scenarios are compatible with any edition, with the caveat is that you will need to do some tweaking depending on how far removed the edition number is. 7th edition is the most different, so that any classic supplement being used with 7th edition will need a once-over. But it is by no means difficult. I've run 1980s scenarios from the pages of White Dwarf quite happily with the 7th edition rules with little or no issue at all. Of all the games I've played, it is perhaps the one that does not particularly need an abundance of supplements and splat books. It has them, especially from its 4th edition on, but it doesn't need them. In fact, I think real-world sources fare much better than those published for the game. Now, my reasoning here is that a horror game can be much more effective if set within the vicinity of an area that the players know well. Their home city, for example. Using real-world sources, maps, guidebooks, and so on, mixed with game resources to add the horror elements, then does notch the atmosphere up a few pegs. One of the greatest compliments I've had, whether it was meant as a compliment or not, was when one player said, "I can't tell what is real and what is made up in this." Conversely, using a setting, particularly a fictional setting such as Lovecraft's own Dunwich or Innsmouth, does feel like you are stepping into the Lovecraft narrative, but at the same time, the fantasy elements, so to speak, creates a disconnect with the horror. For this reason, I mark down the multitude of Secrets of volumes. I don't think that they are a necessary addition to the game. Published scenarios do tend to run from the worst ham of hammer to some finely crafted narratives. So tread carefully there. In my general experience, those volumes that are compilations of short scenarios, Mansions of Madness for example, do not fare very well, in my opinion. There are some standout publications. The aforementioned Masks of Nyarlathotep and Murder on the Orient Express. The Statue of the Sorcerer, Vanishing Conjurer as a double adventure book. The Trail of Sathogua and Beyond the Mountains of Madness. For settings, Cthulhu Britannica and its supplements by Cubicle 7 is a standout, perhaps because I'm British, but also perhaps because they are well written and well presented. Chaosium has published several broad settings based on time periods: Invictus, Dark Ages, Gaslight, 1920s, Atomic Age and Modern, that are very much worth looking into and are mostly covered by the core rules and the Cthulhu Through the Ages book. Malleus Monstrorum is an excellent book. For 6th edition, but a 7th edition version is kicking around. But usable with any, primarily for its descriptions of the many beings and denizens from the mythos and beyond. And finally, the Grand Grimoire of the Cthulhu Mythos is also a book worthy of mention as a fantastic resource. So Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, the Keeper rulebook, is all that you need, other than the usual paraphernalia of dice and pencils and paper. If you want to bring in more options for investigators, then the Investigator Handbook becomes essential. And that is pretty much everything you need. I would also add Malleus Monstrorum and the Grand Grimoire, and Daniel Harm's fantastic Cthulhu Encyclopedia, which was previously the Encyclopedia Cthulhiana, particularly the latter. This book is just chock of references that cover not just Lovecraft, but also those of his circle that were writing in the Lovecraft mode. So creations by Howard Conan's mentioned in there, creations by Clark Ashton Smith and so on. This gathers them all together, and there's a quick reference by Who's Who is just any Call of Cthulhu keeper referee, needs a copy of this book. Not necessarily this edition. There is an updated version of this. Like I said, in this edition it was called the Encyclopedia Cthulhiana, and it's currently going under the guise of the Cthulhu Encyclopedia. Whichever. Fantastic resource. And of course, go out and read or listen to as much Cthulhu fiction as you can. Most of Lovecraft's works are all just handily collected these days. You'll also find a lot of the works, a lot of the stuff by Clark Ashton Smith in that, a lot of other bits and pieces from various authors in this. What else do we have here? Oh, Brian Lumley, another good Cthulhu author. Many more. There are published works all over the place. Also on places like Audible and whatever. Not a sponsor, but you can find audiobooks of the complete works of Lovecraft and other authors. And again, not a sponsor, but the BBC have done a series of radio plays that explore a reinterpretation, a modern reinterpretation of several of Lovecraft's stories, mixed together in a sort of Anglo-American setting, a modern day Anglo-American setting, that are very good. There's one episode I wouldn't recommend that you listen to late at night on your own though. So Call of Cthulhu is an excellent game. One of the pillars of the role-playing genre and a brilliant showcase for the BRP system. It has been a constant since its first publication in 1981 and is at least partially responsible for the explosion in the popularity of Lovecraft's concepts from that time till now. There are a number of games using the Cthulhu mythos as a base, including card, board, computer and other role-playing games. But for me, only Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu has ever really captured the spirit of those stories set down by Lovecraft and his unique circle of literary companions. So I hope you enjoyed my little delve into what is, like I've said, one of my favourite games. Not sure what's next. Be putting my hand into the pile of games that my office is wallpapered in, and we'll see what comes out. Until then.